Okay. Hi, and welcome back to What's the Point? My name is Angela Mathia, and I am an acupuncturist, and I'm talking to Dr. Peter Karen. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
My name is Peter Karen. I'm also an acupuncturist, and I am a professor at Pacific College of Health Science, um, where Angela and I have worked together in the past.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a great little school. So thank you so much for talking again, as always. We were discussing wanting to do this episode about addiction and how it correlates to Chinese medicine. And I was starting by sort of just, one of the things that I like to do for a listener who may be listening and wants to know, I like to ask Peter a lot of questions about treatment because I am a relatively new practitioner and he is far more experienced than I am. So he is just a wealth of knowledge, and I consult with him on many, many patients. So thank you for that always. Um, but one of the questions that I had been sort of talking to him about is this theme I've been seeing with my patients coming up a lot in their struggles with addiction, whether it be substance or, just being addicted to certain forms of connection or communication between people. And we started to sort of have that chat a little, and I was talking to him about a particular patient. So I don't know, where would you like to start, Peter? Do you want to rewind the tape a little? What do you think?
Sure. Well, yeah, let's rewind the tape a little bit. And why don't you share a little bit about this patient and I interrupted Angela partway through this story and said, we should just record this. So why don't you start sharing about this patient a little bit, and then I
Sure.
can talk about it a little, and we'll do a little back and forth and see where we get.
Sure, sure. So, currently, right now, I am working with someone who is recovering from addiction and two people who are in the midst of, in different parts of their journey, acknowledging that some substances are an issue for them and they are finding them addictive. And they're at different parts in their journey. So, I've got a few people right now who are in this world. And one of the people, has just sort of recently been like, you know what, I think that this is really a problem. I'm really committed to trying to get off of the substance. I don't want to do it. And this is a very beloved patient. This person's very funny, very charming, always, tells a great story. So really like a bubbly personality for sure. And I recognized that when this person came in off of the substance, their personality was still lovely and still there, but it was also a little bit more subdued. And this person began talking about how they'd been off this substance since the last time that we chatted and had been really excited about this new person that they were dating. And they were so excited about the communication, felt that it was really, really wonderful and, was really, really consistent and happening super frequently. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the communication sort of dropped off kind of steeply. And this was very distressing for the person. And I was asking Peter, do you think that this is sort of a dopamine issue? And the dopamine that this person was getting from their substance of choice, when that was gone, they began to replace it with the dopamine that they were getting from the communication and attention from a person that they were excited about dating.
So the first thing is, this is a well-known phenomenon in addiction recovery circles, within 12-step programs, within rehab centers. A very common, like, one of the first pieces of advice when someone begins to quit an addiction, when someone goes into recovery, is don't get in a relationship.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's because of exactly what you're saying. I don't like to think about this in terms of dopamine, though it's a fine way to think about it. I like to think about it in terms of distraction and occupation. The mind has been distracted, it's been trained to obsess about a substance, or for gamblers, a behavior. There's many types of addiction. But the mind
Sure.
has been trained to obsess, and it's trained to be distracted. And so as the person begins to slow down, most rehabilitation involves some amount of counseling, some amount of self description of what's been happening, some amount of introspection. So as the person begins slowing down, as they no longer have the distraction of the addictive substance in their life, all sorts of things start to happen that make them uncomfortable. We could describe this as they want to use the substance, but I find it much more useful to think of this as they want to get away from what they're feeling. And when that happens, any port in a storm. And ideally, it's another person who also wants to get away from what they're feeling. And so the two people together can, like, I don't really want to examine these internal root causes of addiction, be it that I wish I'd never entered this career, this marriage, had children, trauma. There's a million reasons people become addicts. But whatever the reason is that they don't want to introspect, it's very easy to become distracted by other things. So in 12-step programs, they often talk about transferring from one addiction to another. So the alcoholic stops drinking and they're like, oh, it's no big deal. It hasn't been a problem. And, I would be saving money if I wasn't buying so many lotto tickets now. It's like, well, that's that transfer of the addiction from one place to another. And I like to think of this as distraction. Like when we slow down, we start to feel stuff, like in meditation. And so if instead of feeling what's going on in my body, I'm thinking to myself, oh, that person I just met, maybe they like me. I wonder why they haven't called me back yet. Then I don't have to go inside.
Right. Okay. And in terms of that distraction, and not really wanting to dive too much into the introspection, is there sort of a correlation with elements in Chinese medicine or patterns that you see in Chinese medicine that kind of correlate to addiction that you know of?
Well, I think of all of the elements as having different things they like to be addicted to. So we can take different types of addiction, different substances or different behaviors, and we can associate them with different elements. That one's pretty straightforward. Lonnie Jarrett does a good job of this in his book, The Clinical Practice of Chinese Medicine, the red one right here. But this is, looking at these things through a 5-element lens can be useful because very frequently the substances that people are drawn to reflect something about their constitution. But at the same time, like, stimulants and sedatives are opposites. People can avoid looking at or experiencing or going inside or slowing down through all sorts of different mechanisms. In Chinese medicine, I think the main way to talk about this would be through the Shen. Because as long as someone's focus is external, as long as their focus is on substance or things or behaviors or what can I get or what's that person doing, then the Shen stays distracted. The Shen stays focused outside. Like we say in Chinese medicine, where the intention goes, the energy follows. And so to introspect, to feel these things, it's like, well, there's nothing going on out here, then all I've got is what's in here. And so my attention goes there, and so does my focus.
Interesting.
But if instead we find external things like, I think I need to buy more XYZ, it doesn't matter. Like, oh, we're not buying stuff. No, I've stopped that. But now I obsess about what I eat. Okay, well, we'd stopped that. Now it's dating. I've really gotten into whatever community of people doing that. Now it can be spirituality. It can be all sorts of things. But the end similarity is that they're all out there.
Right. And they're not in here. They're not internal.
Yeah. Okay. People can become, addicted to working on themselves as a subject, but that's usually in relation to some like very abstract concept of like, oh, I should be, I should look a certain way, or I should feel a certain way, or I should make a certain amount of money. And therefore all of my focus is now, listening to a pickup artist teach me something, or weight loss stuff, or, those sorts of things.
Got you. The pickup artist. Ugh,
Well, we can talk about that as an addiction.
Ew, no. We could, I guess. Oh, well, no, it is. I didn't mean to ew it. I just meant the idea of the pickup artist is ew, but
Sure.
don't want to yuck anyone's yum out there. But anyway, so okay, from that perspective, like the introspection, um, could this, because the way I might look at something addictive being of a more sort of like classical acupuncture persuasion, the way I might look at it is I might start asking that person questions about their childhood, and in fact, like early experiences in childhood. Um, and adolescence, I might look at it as a cycle of 7 and 8 thing. And I might look at, depending on the pulses, I might look at the yin wei, whatever it was. However, in asking those questions about someone's youth, I think that we can kind of glean a lot of information about how that person is wired and why they might be prone to certain things, to certain addictions, to certain, right? Thank you for
Sure.
nodding.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, a person's history tells you more about their future than anything else. That doesn't mean it's particularly accurate. It's just
Right.
more accurate,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, if
Yeah.
a person grew up being, if someone grew up in a house where they were told repeatedly, it's important that children are seen and not heard, then if they're moving into that direction, they're more likely to go for opiates. They're more likely to go for things that cause them to be quiet. If they're more
Right.
rebellious, they might be more into the cocaine and the alcohol and making a lot of noise. Um, if
Interesting.
they grew up lonely, then they may, tend towards very lonely behaviors, or they may flip to the other side. So,
Yeah.
I think once a particular aspect of a person becomes somewhat disordered, like don't express yourself honestly, be quiet and hidden, then people tend to either do that or its opposite as they age. And in Chinese medicine, we know that like opposites have their own similarity, right?
Hmm.
So, obeying exactly what your parents say and rebelling against it entirely are kind of similar
Yeah.
in a yin yang flip sort of a way. And
Right.
neither of them is separate from what you were taught. And, when people have parents that have done a bit of their own work and can really prepare them for the world, that's great. But if what the parents are doing are passing on intergenerational trauma, then often the project for the person becomes asking, like, how do you figure out what you want separate from the influences that you were brought up with and not in relation to?
Mm.
And that's a really hard question that involves introspection and discomfort.
Yeah, it is. I think it's an uncomfortable question for anyone, even people who do have that kind of ability to already interact or have already done a lot of work. I think it's still a very uncomfortable question. And generational trauma is a very fascinating thing. And again, I would probably look at it as an extraordinary vessel thing. I would probably go back to the Chong or something, depending on the case. But generational trauma is not to be ignored. And I would really love to touch on that just for a second. We are
Sure.
carrying, yeah, we're carrying things in our DNA and that don't technically belong to us. They belong to the people that came before us. And I think that it's getting a little bit more attention these days, which is great. But I'd love to give it a little bit more attention. Sometimes the things that we experience are not necessarily directly related to things that have happened in this life. They are directly related to things that happened to our parents or our parents' parents. And I think a great example of this is the study that has been done that descendants of Holocaust survivors often have IBS. They often have intestinal um, difficulties. So that's a huge proof of this. That's huge proof of this theory and this concept. And so, do you also think that addiction can kind of stem from some of these generational traumas?
Well, I mean, that Holocaust study isn't the only one of these either. There's actually a
Hmm.
whole like field of this intergenerational genetic, epigenetic
Hmm.
question mark about the exact
Hmm.
mechanism set of studies where they've seen like people who are the grandchildren of people who encountered starvation tend to put on weight more easily. It's like, well, that makes
Hmm.
sense. Like if
Hmm.
from an evolutionary perspective, if you're at risk of starvation, you'd better store that food.
Right.
Like that
Absolutely.
makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, I don't really see addiction as being something that's going to be passed down genetically. But I
Mm,
do see, so like you mentioned earlier that you would often go to the Chong and to the eight extras for things that you're seeing as intergenerational.
yes.
And I would agree with that if we're looking at it at the level of like genetics, as like if someone was an adopted twin from a traumatized family, an adopted child, then we might want to look, then we would go first to the eight extras, and that would be that's the influence that the parents had.
Mhm.
But if a parent has a full liver luo, there's a real good chance that kid's going to end up with a full liver luo,
Mm.
right? Like they're not inheriting it, but they will be taught it. They will be taught
Yeah.
that like we learn how to manage our emotions through seeing how other people manage emotions when we're kids, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if a parent has a really stuck um, stomach sinew channel, then you'll learn like, oh, I'm not supposed to take these things in. If the parent has, so we pass on behaviors around food, and addictions can be passed on that sort of a way.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
if we see the eight extras as like an intergenerational root cause, then we can see the addiction or the emotional education as the branch that manifests the other issues. That makes sense?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Mm.
Because
Um,
like an example of this is like if you have someone who spent a lot of time getting experiencing trauma or dissociating through their childhood, then we can use eight extras. We can use different things to help them kind of come back and be here and be present. But they still have those years where they weren't present that they've got to figure out what to do with. How do I, maybe that person then is like, well, I still feel separate from a lot of community because I had such a different experience in my childhood. I've seen this with children of immigrants who went through a really rough transition to the US where they're like, I still just feel other and separate in a way that I found like yin and yang chow don't necessarily work super well because they just have a set of years with very different experiences.
sure. Yeah.
That makes some sense.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, and apart from, the hereditary aspect of things, and if we just go back to the sort of individual aspect, and we can talk, you talked a little bit about elementals having a connection to which substances people might be drawn to if they are having, struggles with addiction. And I think that something that comes up really frequently in our education as acupuncturists is the opioid crisis, because there's a lot of things that we can do as acupuncturists that actually help get people off of opioids, and also get people out of pain and keep them out of pain so they don't want to go back on opioids. If physical pain is part of it, but also, most of the time we're out of physical pain and then we still want to take the opioids because there is other pain that we have, and that helps with that too. So it comes up a lot in our education and in our practices, and etc. Um, what element would you associate most? You mentioned it before, and I'm just not remembering it. What element would you associate most with, like the fentanyls, the oxycontins? Like what would you say?
I think they're primarily water. Yeah, almost
Well,
exclusively water, actually.
okay.
And maybe even past that, we could just say that they're very yin, with something like methamphetamines being their opposite of being very
Young.
yang.
Right. Okay.
So they both disorder the shen, they both disorder the person's spirit, but the opioids do it through withdrawal, right? Like they're astringing, they bind up the intestines, they
Mhm.
pull the person inward to the point that they disappear. So there's like a self obliteration through disappearing into the self function of opiates.
Yeah.
So I often think one of the challenges with, and people do these things for a million reasons. So, we got to talk in some generalities about this, but, of course there are exceptions,
Mm.
many exceptions. But I find most commonly with opiates that there's a certain amount of like, I just don't want to be here that comes with it. And opiates allow them to withdraw. You know,
Mm.
if I work at a free clinic in Harlem once a week where we see a lot of addicts, And you can see it's very clear on the street who's using fentanyl and who's using opiates because they're not there. They're either asleep or standing, not, these are not the people talking to each other and trying to hustle. These are the people who are trying to be unconscious as much as possible.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
As
it's
opposed to like the meth side of things, which I see much more as like so much movement and yang being produced that the people aren't there either. Like, how much would you be here if you were on fire, sort of a way. Yeah.
yeah. No, it's a good comparison. Um, because I feel like, and there are obviously scales, and someone who is using methamphetamines is, movement all the time, constant motion, but someone who's not using methamphetamines, but is maybe, kind of like using Adderall or, maybe using cocaine or something like that. There's like a little bit of a different level. It's still movement, it's just not as constant. And then if you like kind of go a level under that, like maybe there's somebody who's like a serious workaholic and, always has to be doing something, always has to be busy because standing still is terrifying because again that invites introspection, and it's like the flip side of that coin is going so far inside, so far internal, that you are past introspection and you're at oblivion. And
Yep.
so yeah, okay, I see what you mean. So it's like water, and maybe the methamphetamine is the fire aspect, more or less.
Yeah. I'd say meth is kind of a combination of fire and metal. Um,
Mm,
it has a bunch of metal functions in that a lot of people with meth become obsessed with like cleanliness or purity or cleaning things up in a very metal sort of a way.
it's interesting.
Um, yeah, there's some historical stuff about this in the history of meth that I think is outside the scope of what we're talking about here. But
But
it
I
was
want to know.
invented in Germany in the 20s.
Oh, right. That's right. Oh, okay. I know what
It
you're
was
talking. Yeah.
sold under the brand name Pervitin, if anyone is
Right.
curious.
Right.
So, the history of amphetamines has this ongoing metal issue to it,
Hmm.
in a way that, say, something like ecstasy, which is much more of a fire drug, is much more about like love and losing oneself in
Connection.
connection with others. Meth is not really a connecting drug. I mean, people engage in a lot of sexual activity on it, but it's not. I don't think anyone thinks of meth as like romantic and loving. I don't think we're going to see a lot of methamphetamine assisted psychotherapy out there.
No, I don't
Um,
think so.
yeah,
No.
I hope not. I hope not.
Yeah, that would be a disaster. Yeah, just a lot of people running around. No, but like to your point, you're bringing up, sort of like the connection and like, sort of like almost being addicted to love and the feelings of love, and then there's sex addiction to porn addiction, things like that. Elementally, are they more fire related as well? They're more fire as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence about porn addiction, but any addiction that has to do with love and romance and sex and connection between people, like there's certainly dark aspects to sex addiction that fall into other categories. But a lot of it is fire related, which is often about like losing oneself in a group energy. So like some cult related things we could look at as addiction like.
Mhm.
And often that's a fire thing. It's like, well, I'm addicted to this community, to being a part of this thing. Like addiction is a funny word for something like that, but it's kind of accurate.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I don't really see a problem saying that you can be addicted to that, because you can be, if we are defining addiction
Yeah.
as, feeling like you need something to survive or you are fundamentally different, um, that sounds like addiction to me.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, you know, the addictions where abstaining is not an option are hard. So, like food addiction is a challenging one because you can't just not eat.
True.
Um, and addiction to a community is hard because we all need community.
Hmm.
And so when someone has like spent time in a cult or spent time with any sort of person who has some authority over them, people who end up in abusive relationships and can't leave. That can be an example of this. It's like, yeah, you do need these connections. You just need them with healthier things and with healthier people, which makes it hard.
It does make it hard. And I do think, and obviously I'm not, a neuroscientist or anything like that, but this is purely my opinion. I do feel like it does kind of wire your brain a certain way. And okay, I'll use an example from my own life, a personal example. I grew up in a dance studio, and some of the things that like sent off major reward signals in my brain were learning a new skill, getting really good at it, borderline perfecting it, whatever it was, and then getting the praise of the teacher who was showing me that skill or teaching me that skill, right? So those are huge reward centers for me because I was conditioned to believe that or to feel that from the age of 3 onward. So, I was just telling you, I started to learn how to play the drums over the weekend, and like it went a lot better than I thought it would. I was saying to you. And, as I was doing it, it showed me a few things about how my brain is wired personally, for sure. Some of it just being the fact that I'm left-handed and like definitely needed to switch a few things around to make it make sense to my body and brain. But also how great I felt after learning a skill and being able to perform that skill after a few minutes. I was like, wait, I got this, question mark. Like, I got this. That's amazing. And I like floated off the couch where I was sitting, like practicing on this makeshift drum set that I made out of pillows and boxes because, you know. Didn't have one handy. Didn't realize that my brother had actually left one in the basement, an actual drum set. So that's information for me later. But anyway, with my makeshift drum set, I like bounced up off the couch. I was like, I feel so good. I felt so good. I also wanted to keep doing that thing. And I wanted to keep getting better at it and keep succeeding at it. And I do feel like, again, that's how my brain was wired. So it was major reward. I was like, okay, this is amazing. I want to keep doing this. And I do think that that is a quality in abusive relationships that you kind of get a little bit addicted to. It's a quality in these cults and these communities that you do get a little bit addicted to, especially when it's that intermittent reinforcement that many of my not so lovely dance teachers in childhood used to do, where they would make you feel really, really good, but then like 90% of the time you'd feel really, really bad. And so that 10% comes up and you just get this explosion of well-being essentially. And I think that in these abusive conditions, that is something that you can get addicted to because you feel really, really bad most of the time. And then when you feel good, you feel elated. I don't know. Am I wrong here or?
No, I think you're completely right. I mean, it's no surprise that most addicts have a really good time relapsing, maybe not psychologically, but after being, deprived of their drug of choice, it works better.
Mhm.
If anyone out there listening is a regular marijuana user, if you take a month off, then it'll be a whole different experience. So the lack of, using the dopamine language, the lack of dopamine triggers allows you to have a stronger dopamine trigger,
Right.
which is itself addictive, which is, the classic abuse cycle of like abuse followed by a honeymoon period, followed by a cooling off period, followed by an abusive period, followed by a honeymoon period is like, that's, there's something almost a little bit mundane about a lot of abusive relationships because they just tend to follow that pattern.
It's a pattern. Yeah, it's a pattern.
Yeah, it's a pattern. And
Yeah.
it's a common pattern, and cults work that way. But
Mhm.
like, this is where it gets a little tricky, with a lot of meditation and spiritual practices, some of these things can definitely get culty quickly. But there is a certain amount of like, you if you're trying to teach these things, you want the people learning them to decouple their sense of success or failure from your feedback to a certain degree.
Mhm.
So, like, I'm meditating so that you'll tell me I'm the best is not effective meditation, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
So, if my motivation for personal growth is to make someone else happy, and my continued like improved personal behavior is dependent upon their positive reaction to my growth, that's not really like long-term sustainable in general. It's generally not
Mhm.
very healthy. Like, well, if you break up with me, I'll go back to drinking. It's like, that's not good.
Oof.
Like, I quit drinking for you. It's
And
like, well,
that's
that's
manipulative too and
that's
abusive.
a problem.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, whether or not the person intends it to be, that's the function of it,
It's
right?
the
Like, the person might be completely honest. They quit drinking for that person.
Mhm.
But that doesn't, yeah, the end function of that is a poorly functioning relationship that's going to cause damage to everybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there are, I think, everyone that I know, myself included, has had somebody in their life say something to that effect to them
Hmm.
and has made that person, you know, say, well, I can't leave. I can't leave this situation, So it's, yeah, it's a very manipulative and shitty. And even if they don't mean it to be, it is. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Ugh,
this is a really important thing to think about when talking about addicts. Like, we want to decouple their intent from the effects of their behavior.
totally.
Um, Often in 12-step communities, they'll talk about, like, you're talking to this person's ambassador, you're talking to their representative. They're not really
Mhm,
here. You're talking to
mhm.
the addict side of them. And it's like, do they intend to cause harm? It's like, no, they intend to drink.
Exactly.
Like, the harm is somewhere between incidental and accidental. Obviously, there are exceptions to this, but very
Yes.
often when this is part of why 12-step programs have people like make amends for the things that they've done, even if they were blackout drunk and not present for it. It's like, you gotta own the things that came from your
Yeah.
decisions, even if
Mhm.
you didn't intend them. And I mean, this is the whole idea of like, someone can be abused without someone being an abuser. That makes sense, which is much different
Absolutely.
from like, you know intending to cause direct harm,
Yeah.
which is a thing people also do.
Absolutely true. That is true. I think, I don't mean to generalize, but I do think, like, broadly speaking, most people who struggle with addictive doing it to hurt anyone. Like, they are taking the substance for their own reasons. It has nothing really to do with, like, the external, pretty much. And the effect, so just to say, we're not saying that people who have addictive behaviors are, you know, meaning to cause harm, like you just said. I'm just reiterating your point. That's not at all what we're saying. But yeah, it's very personal, and then it's almost like the collateral damage or the fallout of that person's choices often do cause harm, but they don't intend for it to.
Yep.
Hmm.
I mean, there's some ideas that I think are pretty common in addiction, in recovery circles. Like, no matter where you go, there you are. So, like, you got to deal with your stuff. But we also have this really interesting example from the Vietnam War of like, a very large percentage of the soldiers who went to Vietnam ended up using opiates, using drugs while they were there.
Mhm.
And most of them did not stay addicts when they came back. So, like, there is situational, like, I don't want to be here for a good reason. And if that reason goes away, then I might change my behavior. And I see this a lot at the free clinic up in Harlem, where it's like, I don't know how long it would take me being homeless and mentally ill to start using drugs, but it's not that long.
Yeah.
Um, and if those things went away, then that might change. I'm not now. So,
Right.
um,
Right.
yeah,
No, that's a very
there's a sometimes it is just situational.
absolutely. And I think that another thing that I think is important is to destigmatize, language and thoughts around people who are addicted to substances, because that literally could be anyone. It could be you, it could be me, it could be your next door neighbor, your fifth grade teacher, it could be anyone. Um, because to your point, it can be very situational, and none of us are really that many steps away from being a person without a house, without a job, without, a
Sure.
community. We're not. We have some fail safes, most of us do, in place, but um they're really if we're going to play 6 degrees of separation about it, like none of us are really that far away from it. So really it could happen to you any moment. So
I've
yeah.
heard a lot of stories from a lot of people up in Harlem, and plenty of them were perfectly well functioning people with apartments, and then a few bad days happened, and the consequences of that ended up with them addicts on the street.
Yep.
Like yeah, it's easier than I wish it was.
Yeah, I wish that it was not that easy too, because it would make living a lot less scary, and living is terrifying. Anyway.
So, when it comes to treating these things, I think a lot of the time as practitioners, our job is to figure out like what are the major causes of stress and distress in these people's lives.
Mhm.
And if we can help to limit those things or resolve those things, like when I take students up to Harlem, one of the first things I say to them is that a lot of the root causes here are poverty, and that's outside the scope of our practice. There's nothing I can do about that as a medical practitioner. But
Right.
what I can do is help people sleep. I can help people who are on opiates to poop. I can help people to like get a little bit of clarity so that if and when options show up, they can do their best to take them. Maybe that just means that they're more lucid when communicating with a social worker,
Mhm.
but that may be all the difference. Um,
Absolutely.
and we don't get to know the outcomes of a lot of these things, So
Mm.
yeah, there, we've got we got some good cases of this.
Yeah. And I think, and this is so self-centered, but it would be so wonderful if we could see the outcomes of these things more regularly, just to like be able to know that somebody is doing better than they were before. Just because you care. It's not like it. We care. I mean, we care about people that we treat. You know what I mean? So, um, sometimes even in the situation where I work, I work with a very different demographic of people, and they are decidedly not homeless. They are very gainfully employed. It's just a very different demographic, and yet we still see addictive behaviors. It happens. It's a very human thing to have happen, and so um, even in those types of circumstances where like I know that that person has a secure roof over their head, I know that they have a secure income, I still find myself thinking about these people and wondering how they're doing and hoping that they're doing well. And side note, selfish note, would be great if we could
Yeah.
know. But
Well, I mean, one thing I think about kind of regularly here is that we're practicing this ancient medicine that had no understanding of the world we currently live in. Like a natural
Mhm.
rhythms, sure, it has an understanding of nature that's quite deep, and rhythms that I think we're still subjected to. But the level of city and the way culture works and the way that the internet works, all of these things are not a part of the history of the medicine. And I think one of the books that I found really helpful for this subject is a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, which was written by Freud. And he like the basic argument of this book was like, we weren't made to do this. And
Yeah.
so we have to find ways to cope, to make
Hmm.
this a functional world, to make civilization in its current form work for us. We have that distorts parts of who we are. And from the Chinese medicine perspective, I don't know about distorting who we are, but it's certainly something that like each of us has to figure out how we can function within society, ideally with like limited chemical support. And it's no surprise that so many people uh, who don't consider themselves addicts are taking Adderall twice a day, are drinking 2 pots of black coffee, and then taking a sleeping pill at night
Hmm.
along with
Yeah.
some alcohol. Like these are
Yeah.
behaviors that some of this we would look at and go, well, that's obviously addiction. And then a lot of this we go, this is kind of in a gray area that's socially acceptable.
Right. And again, I think to just sort of piggyback on what you're saying, it's like this social acceptability part of it too. And I mean, like, if we didn't consider drinking, 2 pots of coffee a morning every day, and taking a sleeping pill after having 2 glasses of wine at night, if we didn't consider that socially acceptable, then I would say probably vast majority of the population would also be considered addicts, quote unquote. And we just don't consider them that because we've decided that that's okay, that that's fine. But I mean, if we like rewind the tape again, second time I'm using that, and if I'm just realizing, like, what if a Gen Z person listens to this? Do they know what tape is? Like, I hope, just that VCR, little VHS action. Anyway, I have to stop talking about that. So if we like kind of rewind backwards and go to like prohibition, where alcohol was banned, couldn't drink, you couldn't do, it was illegal, and you were considered sort of like, you know, if you were considered sort of like a bad person or something if you did, or like morally reprehensible or something like that if you did, and a straight up criminal if you tried to get alcohol, right? um and then we just decided that alcohol was okay again, so it's fine now that you have a cocktail at night, you know what I mean? So we go, it's like all, I mean, there was cocaine and how many, and full on codeine and stuff like that in your things that you buy off the shelf a long time ago. That's an even better example than alcohol, Angela. Like, come on, wake up. But there was codeine in all of these things, and now that's illegal. Like, you can't, people are buying fentanyl off on the street, you know what I mean? And being addicted to it. So anyway, I
Well,
do think
standards for what counts as an addiction are culturally defined in a lot of ways, and they change over time.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting to see how, like, currently, we have this fentanyl crisis, and it's because fentanyl is such an evil drug. But we can go back and look at British history, and like they had a gin crisis because gin was this evil liquor, and it's like, well, that was during a time where there was a lot of poverty and famine, and gin was the inexpensive alcohol. And like we have gin around today, and like no one is like, I don't know anybody who's, I know a handful of alcoholics. I don't know anyone who's a gin addict.
No, I don't think I've ever.
So
Yeah.
when we look at like the fentanyl crisis, it's like, this isn't about fentanyl. Fentanyl is the mechanism through which this is occurring. But if it wasn't fentanyl, it would be other things.
It would be
this
something.
doesn't, because this is a branch. Like addictions are ultimately branches.
Right.
There's, without addressing some level of root, then all you get is this transference. Yep. And you mentioned cocaine earlier, which you use tincture of cocaine that you could buy for teething babies.
Jesus.
Yep, one of the primary functions, because it numbs the gums.
Sure.
So we have this in the 80s and 90s. White people had cocaine and black people used crack, and crack was vilified and cocaine wasn't. And honestly, like, this might annoy some people to hear, but we're not that far away from that with Adderall and methamphetamine. It's like, Absolutely. Is methamphetamine stronger? Yeah, but like, there are plenty of functional people who are using meth to get through their day, just like they would use Adderall. Yeah. This was in the early 2000s, much more common in the gay community here in New York. Yeah, I mean, what is and is not an acceptable way to cope with the difficulties of being alive in our society are determined by the society.
Right.
And all you have to do is go to a different part of the country and this changes, or a different country. Like in the northern Midwest, like incredible amounts of alcohol are consumed. And it's like, oh yeah, of course you have a 6-pack of beer every day when you get home. That's normal. You can pull up maps of amount of alcohol consumed per capita in the United States, and there's just a big red region in like Wisconsin and Michigan, and yeah.
I mean, of course, this is making me want to go home and grab myself a gin cocktail and get mixing. LOL, kidding.
And a little meth,
and just like a little, like
just a little meth,
a drop or two. Meth. not, barely anything, just a little pep in my step. Anyway, but yeah, so um, kidding aside, I had an interesting patient in the school clinic some years ago when I was still a student, and this person had suddenly lost function in his hand, and it was completely contracted, sort of fingers to the inside of the forearm, basically. And this person was a musician and was like losing income basically because there was so much difficulty, obviously, using his instruments with a hand that was like less than functional. And it was like strangely tense in areas and lax in others when you palpated it. And then when you get to talking to him, um, you recognize that he is probably a little bit of a substance abuser. And to your example, like earlier, you said in the northern Midwest, I think you said they're like consuming a 6-pack of beer every day. We were saying, oh God, this kid is consuming a 6-pack of beer every night. Like that's so much beer. Like he's drinking that every single night. And he's also, buying drugs of various kind, like that too is happening. But it's funny comparatively, like in New York, we were all sitting around going, he has to stop drinking this much beer. It's so much beer, so much alcohol every night. Um, but he was an interesting case, and he had these dreams. You might like this, Peter. I'm sure you will. But he he had these dreams where he would fall asleep, and then dream him would continue on having a life. Dream him would walk down to the bodega, get whatever Dream him needed, and then walk down the street and buy drugs at the corner, and then, walk up and like use the drugs. And then he would wake up and continue with his waking life. When he would go back to sleep, he would continue from where he left off in the dream life. And he would continue with that narrative. So he was basically never resting, but also living two completely separate lives, one in a dream state and one in a waking state. And I thought that was the most fascinating part of this case, in my opinion. Um, but I don't know. I know that's a slight departure from addiction, even though he was somebody who does have some addictive behaviors. But like, can you talk a little about what that might be in Chinese medicine? Like what kind of Shen disturbance or like Hun disturb, like what are we talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably bleed his outer liver shoes for that.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I mean, the first part is it just sounds incredibly boring. Like that's someone like he's literally just like, oh, I go to the bodega, I get a beer, I go to sleep, I go to the bodega, I get a beer. It's like just literally exactly what you're doing in your day-to-day life.
Right.
So I would be curious what other drugs he's using as a part of this. People who drink a 6-pack as opposed to say like a liter of vodka. People who are drinking a 6-pack of beer a night generally don't have a ton of dreams. Like they tend not to enter our REM sleep very effectively.
Mm.
So it's kind of interesting that he's having dreams at all, especially with such consistency and fidelity. Like dream recall and going to bed drunk don't really go together super well. So the idea that he's like waking up and being like, oh, just left my dream self at 3 p.m. while buying liquor at the bodega. And when I go to sleep, it'll be 3 p.m. and I'm buying liquor at the bodega.
Yeah.
Seems not what I would expect. That being said, there are lots of substances that can affect the dreams in interesting ways. In Western herbology, it's a set of herbs that are often called flying herbs.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, there are substances people can use to affect their dreams in interesting ways. So I'd be curious
Yeah.
to know what else he was doing.
I would be curious too, but I don't think he was doing like Blue Lotus or, like I don't think he was like in his herb cabinet, making a tea
Seems
before.
unlikely.
Probably. But it is interesting that you mentioned being drunk and going to bed. Like, yeah, for sure. I think we've all had the experience. Don't tell my mother that, you go to bed drunk and like you just are kind of, out. And you wake up feeling terrible. But I actually don't think that 6 beers was making him drunk anymore because he was so like used to it, if that makes sense.
I mean, there's subjective experience of alcohol intoxication, and then there's blood alcohol levels, right?
Right.
And we can, like, this is often referred to as state-based learning. So, when I was 16 and smoking marijuana for the first time, I was pretty non-functional. I don't smoke weed all the time, but I've smoked quite a bit in the past 20 years. And like, I can smoke a joint at a party and have a conversation with people, and it doesn't make a huge difference, primarily due to state-based learning and people who drink quite a bit. I mean, like, this is not advice. Don't do this. But if a group of people are all drunk together, like, the one who drunk drives the most should be the drunk driver. Like,
That is an
don't do it.
unhinged
Don't do it.
statement.
I'm not encouraging you to do it. But the person who has the most experience has the most experience. And so, like, while their subjective experience of being drunk after 6 beers might be non-existent, they might
Right.
feel identical. That doesn't mean that they actually are. So there's decent research on, like, people doing logic exams, IQ tests, all sorts of different tests under different levels of alcohol intoxication. And what they tend to find is that people who are regular drinkers overestimate their normalcy. It's like they still are like, oh, I'm completely normal, but their inhibitions are still lower.
For
So
sure.
the chances of them being like, well, I didn't buy that lottery ticket because I was drunk. Second lottery ticket example. I didn't buy that lottery ticket because I was drunk. I bought that lottery ticket because I wanted a lottery ticket and I just felt like it. It's like, well,
Sure.
but if you were sober, would you have?
Would you have bought that lottery
Would you
ticket?
have
Yeah.
wanted to? Yeah.
Would you have had the desire for a lottery ticket? Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting. And to one of your other points, I used to know someone who was an avid weed smoker and insisted that he drove better when he was high and refused to wear a seatbelt because he thought that it made him drive better. So plenty of pathology to unpack there, but
That's not good. That's bad.
exactly. Yeah.
Don't drive drunk. Don't drive high.
Don't drive drunk, don't drive high, and always wear your seatbelts. Don't be an idiot. Like this person I used to know. But yeah, like there is this like overestimation and like of ability. And I used to say to this person, like, I don't think that's true. And, you know, was met with an absolute like, no, I was like as if I hadn't said anything. But yeah, I do think that there is that misestimation or overestimation of ability, because people feel subjectively, they just feel they're like, I'm fine, I feel completely normal, I feel like I do when I wake up in the morning and I haven't had anything to drink or I hadn't smoked anything. But that doesn't mean, again, to your point, that their blood alcohol is at zero. It's not. So, there's a level of impairment there, whether they like to think it or not.
Well, it's similar to, like, people who drink quite a bit will often say that they don't get hungover. And it's like, well, if you take a week off, I bet you'll be shocked at how good you feel when you
See
wake up.
now, there you go.
Like, this kind of circles back to what we were saying earlier about dopamine. It's like base levels change. What's normal is a shifting landscape. And so if you do something frequently enough, then by definition, it's normal.
Yeah.
So
sure.
abusive relationships become normal, casual drug use becomes normal, not sleeping, oversleeping, undereating, overeating. All of these things can start to be like, well, this is just how I do things. And like, well, I know I should do it slightly differently, but this doesn't feel like excess. It doesn't feel like I'm being indulgent. And it's like, well, yeah, that's because you've normalized that through behavior over time. And that's not a failure of a person's mind or their will. That's just how we work.
Yeah, that's how we learn and how we integrate what we learn and integrate experience as well. I mean, it's the same thing as like learning not to touch a hot stove. You do it once
Sure.
and you're like, oh shit, I'm never going to do that again. That sucked. but it's the opposite side of that. You know what I mean? Like you are just learning a different behavior and incorporating it and then saying like, well, this is that. This is how it is.
Well, or you become a chef and you get to the point where you're like Burns Schmerns. Who cares?
Who cares? I know. Oh my God. We joke that my mom has like, I don't know how she got this, but like she can touch thing, like she'll take like a pan out of the oven. She won't do it with her bare hands, of course. She'll put it down. She'll take off the pot holder or like, whatever. And then she'll just be like messing around. And we're like, what are you doing? Like you're going to burn yourself. She's like, it's fine. It's not even that hot. It's like, actually, it's literally 350 degrees, but whatever. Do you? The other thing that we had kind of discussed a little bit was sort of replacing one substance with another, or replacing one experience with another because you're trying to not take drugs or drink or whatever it is, and then that can be sort of replaced with a person. What about people who don't necessarily ever struggle with substance addiction, but do seem to have a tendency toward, I'm trying to find the best way to put this, almost sort of like becoming addicted to people or addicted to relationships. I mean, I guess it's kind of the same thing as like as a sex addiction or, dating addiction or whatever, but like there's no other addictive quality there. It's just when it comes to this one very like specific thing and it's not replacing anything. What elemental imbalance or pattern diagnosis, like do you see anything that's typical of that in your work, or have you?
Well, I mean, some people are more extroverted and some people are more introverted, and some of that is physiological and fine, and some of that's pathological and due to experiences that the people have had, Um, Chinese medicine wise, I think everyone needs to be able to be comfortable being alone by themselves. I think that's important. That doesn't mean that you prefer to be alone by yourself, but it's important to be like neutral about it at worst. That doesn't mean all the time, like if something big happens in someone's life, it can be very important to have community around. Community is also important, but everyone should spend some time by themselves. Whether that's going for a walk or a hike, take out the headphones, just be with your own company. There are plenty of people who never do that ever. It's very easy these days to wake up and your alarm is music or a podcast or the news, and then you're showering with music on, and then you put in headphones while you're making breakfast and you wear them until you get to where you work, where you start talking to people, and then you leave work to go to the bar and you're with people, and then you go home and you're with your partner, and then you go to bed. Like, this is very easy to do, in part because a lot of people don't like being alone. So it's important to be able to be by yourself, because the things that you experience by yourself are often things that you need to know, need to experience, need to confront. Often there's a lot of wisdom to be gained through that. But the flip side of this is like, you should be able to be comfortable being in community. That doesn't mean every community. There's plenty of communities I don't want to be a part of, from political communities to the religious to race-based, all sorts of stuff out there. I'm like, thank you. I don't need to be comfortable here because I don't need to be here at all. But if a person's like, I just don't really like being around people, then that's the flip side of not wanting to be alone. The discomfort that we encounter in community is also important.
Yeah.
The feeling of being, inadequate or stupid or stifled or whatever, not good enough, better than these people, whatever it is. These are important things to confront too. And, if you find that most communities don't work for you, maybe it's the communities, but it's kind of like, if you keep going on dates with people who are just horrible people, it's like, well, at the 20th one, like, you're doing something. Like, I'm not saying these people are horrible or not horrible, but like
Mhm.
the common factors used. So you're either selecting horrible people or you're
Right.
bringing out the horribleness, or like, that doesn't mean it's your fault or not. Like, maybe that's just what's around and you're out of options, but it's still in your control to change that.
Mm.
Or it's not in anyone else's control, at least. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think like the basics there is like you should be able to be comfortable doing either one, and it should wax and wane.
Hang on one second. So I'm just saving the first section of this on our um, podcast. And then once it saves, we can just start another one.
Sure.
Because it does, like, it cuts you off at an hour and then it's like, sorry, you gotta do it again. Um, that's really interesting though. I think we should probably, yeah, I'll just have you sum up what you said again because I think that last
Sure.
little, yeah, tag got cut off. But I agree with you. It's important to spend time alone.
What's I have some friends who are like just don't like people, and it's like, well, you got to get over that. Like, you can not like spending time with most people, but you
Mhm.
got to find some people because we're pack animals. And then
Yeah.
I've got like one friend springs to mind where he like can't be alone for too long,
Oh
and it's like,
God.
dude, you got to balance this out. Like, this doesn't mean you're like always by yourself, but you need to be able to like comfortably enjoy your own company for an hour.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that that's like, it's it's not as hard as I think people think it is, but you did mention, like the constant sort of distraction, right? Like there's something in your ear or, you're reading something or you're scrolling or whatever it is. Um, like there's just some constant sort of activity. And maybe if it's accessible to everyone, because I mean, like, I'm be honest with you, when I'm in New York, I don't want to be without my headphones because it's way overstimulating for me. I need
Sure.
to, like block some of that out and just focus on what's happening here and just sort of like, for lack of better words, like a little bit dissociate from it because it's very stressful for me. It's not my favorite place to be. But when I'm taking a walk in the woods, I like to take my headphones off. I like to listen to music while I'm walking because it's fun and I love music. But I also like to take my headphones off because then I can hear everything and it's kind of amazing. It's just such a pretty little symphony, like the wind and the leaves and the water running. It's amazing and beautiful. And I do feel more connected when I have like music free moments while I'm hiking. I feel even more connected, I think, to myself and also I hate to say it this way, it makes me sound so like hippy dippy, but just like nature, you know what I mean? Like it just makes me feel so connected to the woods. Um,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I mean, I would almost summarize that connection to the woods as like you're existing within rhythms that you are not deciding and that are not being
Mm.
decided by people. You're existing within the rhythms of nature. Like, it might be for a brief period of time, but it's true nonetheless. And you can choose through technology, through other people, through whatever to leave that. And like in New York, what natural rhythm? Like,
There's
that's
nothing.
not the rhythm here. Um,
Yeah.
but
It's unnatural
there's
rhythm.
yeah. Um, yeah, so I mean, just like people, it's important to be able to be comfortable in groups and by yourself. It's important to be able to be in nature and be okay. And there's plenty of reasons. There are plenty of good reasons people have why all of these things are not possible, but those are things that are worth working on.
I agree. I'm gonna restart the recording.
Sure.
When do you want to like wrap this up? It's like it's 8:30 already.
Relatively soon. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we've been going for an hour, so I
Yeah.
don't know. We can start wrapping up, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh,
I really liked what you just said, so I'm gonna restart and then say like I'll semi summarize what you were saying that it's important to be able to spend time in a community, but also important to spend time alone,
Yeah,
and
go
then
for it.
just like, yeah, tell them what you said about the nature thing, and maybe have you say it nicer than I'm gonna say it, because I'm sure I'll butcher it.
We'll see.
Well, and so, you and I were just talking a little bit in the space between recordings. And to sum up what you were saying earlier, you said it's really important to be able to spend time within a community, but it's also very important to be able to spend time alone. And that both of those things are, you know, things that people should be able to do and work on if they can't. And we did have another little side conversation that I'd like to share. But before I share that, do you have anything that you want to add to that summation, or
Well, sure. I mean, so there's lots of good reasons, and respectable reasons why people have trouble in groups or why people have trouble by themselves.
Mhm.
Those reasons can be related to trauma. Those reasons can be related to, you know, sensory issues. Like there's
Yeah.
lots of reasons for this, but these are things that are human. And so they're important to work on because we need the ability to be by ourselves and introspect, to heal, to get new ideas, to gain wisdom from our experiences. And we need to be able to be in community and spend time with other people so that we don't get really weird, which happens when we're by ourselves too long.
It's
And so
true.
that we can like bring what we do have to offer into communities, because
Mhm.
otherwise it's selfish and it's just for us, and that's not good for us either.
Yeah, I think sharing is caring, right? No, but really though, it is important, especially when you have something beautiful to offer, to actually offer it to other people, so that they can benefit from it. And ideally they're offering something in return as well, because that's community. And I would love to exist in a barter system of sorts, you know what I mean? But unfortunately we don't live in that world. But I think we can just have that. It does has a different meaning, you know what I mean? um but anyway, the sort of nice side conversation that you and I were having was, you had said something really lovely. And just for a little bit of background, I was saying, um, when I go out into the woods for hikes, which I really like to do super frequently, oftentimes I do enjoy listening to music. And then I'll take my headphones off so I can just listen to everything that's going on around me. I can listen to the wind, kind of rustling the leaves in the trees, which I always really like. I can listen to water if there's flowing water. Sometimes you'll hear a little animal scurrying. It's very cute. And it makes me feel more connected to myself, is what I had said to Peter, and also more connected to nature and to the world around me. And then you said something very lovely. You said that it does make you feel connected to the natural rhythm that you don't really necessarily have control over, and that there's something really beautiful in that. And would you mind elaborating on that?
Sure. um as a city person,
Mhm.
um I can exist in outside of the temperature of the outside air and the amount of precipitation. I can exist in spaces that are pretty much entirely created, run, and at the whim of people. And as soon as, even walking in Central Park, it's an artificial park that was created. All the boulders were brought in.
Mhm.
It's not a natural thing. There's a certain type of surrender that can happen when you're truly in nature on nature's terms. And that doesn't mean that you have to, attempt to cross the Arctic Circle. It doesn't have to be dramatic.
I don't.
But when you're well, you can. But when you're going for a hike in the woods, especially if you're going on a backpacking trip for a few days, if you're not bringing with you things that allow you to control your attention, like headphones,
Mhm.
or a cell phone with Twitter and Instagram, um, then you're forced to harmonize with natural rhythms. I've met plenty of people who talk about this in and of itself being an aspect of healing.
Mhm.
I spent a little bit of time in the Amazon, and they talked a lot about just being in the Amazon being a healing process. And I certainly found it to have some profound effects on me. So it might feel mundane and simple to go for an hour-long walk in your local park. But if you can do it without distraction, it can be an important meditation that can end up doing a lot for mental health, for physical health, for flexibility and adaptability. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can relate some of this to exercise, putting yourself in different situations, like putting yourself in different yoga postures, leads to the ability to be more flexible when you're forced into an unexpected position.
Mm-hmm. That's true. No, that's true. I mean, to your point, when I was spending more time in the dance world, and I was also choreographing a lot because I was teaching and also making my own work, et cetera, et cetera. So I was making dances super frequently, from like really tiny little phrases to 20-minute pieces. And there were times, a lot of the work that I did was when I was having those moments of sort of like deep introspection that weren't really curated by people, or were, I mean, it's a hard thing to say, but like I would have my headphones on, I would be listening to music, and I would be on the train. And when you're on the train, even though that is obviously a man-made, structure, and it's on a track, whatever, so you know where you're going, and when you're going to get there, whatever. It's still this like weird little, like, I don't even know, like vacuum almost, where you are unable to do anything else but sort of surrender to sitting on this train for this period of time. And this was like a little bit more pre smartphone, etc. So I would sit there and I'd have my headphones on, and I would be getting into this sort of like flow state where I was just like diving inward, and I would be sort of like rapid fire visualizing what I wanted out of a dance, and I would be writing it down in a journal. And so I would write, turn over your right shoulder, step onto your right foot, and then lunge out onto the left foot, sweep the arm, like whatever it is. Like I would write this all out and then be able to translate it back when I would like look at it again. And I think now when I'm out in nature taking a hike, it's a similar thing. If I take the headphones off and I'm kind of just like in that more where you really don't have control over it, you have nothing to do but follow the path that nature has, just like naturally given you. You can't, if you go off, who knows, you're gonna get lost. Like you have to stay on this path. I feel like I'll have more creative inspiration at that time, and I'll just like sit down somewhere and I'll write a poem or whatever, just because it'll come into my head, and it's a clarity thing. It's a clearing too. So I always feel very refreshed after these. I always felt very energized after my like choreographing train rides. I always feel refreshed and energized after my like writing, walking hikes. And I'm able to connect with people more deeply and more regularly after I've done those things alone. So it's a sort of long-winded way of saying I think that's probably why it's important, or one of the reasons why it's important is because like if you do spend time alone, you're just a little bit better at spending time with other people, or something. Maybe that's just how I work, but I wanted to throw that out there too.
Well, I mean, I agree. I think there's a yin and yang to it. Like when you spend time alone, then you end up with things that other people may not know or have thought of that you can bring back to them, like new choreography. But if you're always with people, like any information or understanding or wisdom that's attained is kind of attained by the group a lot of the time. Not like you can't have individual experiences in a group,
Mhm.
but that sort of like deep focus occurs like best when one is alone, even if they're surrounded by people, like on a train.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, time alone acquires new ideas. Those ideas can be brought into community. You have something to share. You get to hear what other people have come up with. And then you can return to your own space to work with that. And that ebb and flow, it doesn't have to be 50-50. This is where the extrovert introvert thing would come in. I spend quite a bit of time alone because I find it very helpful for my thought process and for my practice.
Yeah.
That's not like acupuncturists should do this. It's like, that's how it works for me.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's individual.
But you got to have some of both.
Exactly. You can't have, like, it's not an all or nothing situation for sure. For sure. Well, if you don't have anything else to add or that you wanted to bring up, I think we can probably close out this chat if you're feeling ready. But if you have anything that you'd like to summarize before we do that.
Well, I think we're kind of just, there's so much to talk about around addiction and in Chinese medicine, from like, what are we talking about when we talk about addiction, to how do you treat it, to what lenses can you use to look at it through, to, how does this relate to just places we're more and less comfortable, and tendencies that might not be addictions, but are just patterns. There's so much there. So I think this has been a great conversation because we had a little bit of like an overview of like, what is addiction? How are we thinking about this? How are we looking at it? Some of the causes of it, from intergenerational trauma to like attempting to live in a world that we're not really built for, to the different ways that this can show up. What is a culturally defined addiction? What is a culturally defined acceptable behavior?
Mhm.
If we started defining more than 2 cups of coffee a day as an addiction, then a lot of people would be in trouble really quick.
Totally.
But yeah, I mean, I think this has been a nice like scouting of the terrain of the conversation. I'm looking forward to some more conversations on the topic and diving in a little deeper. We got to
Yeah.
bring you up to the Harlem Clinic at some point.
Oh, yes. I have been meaning to do that. I really would like to.
Yeah,
Yeah. And do you guys still
let's
do it
set it
on
up next
Wednesday?
semester.
Yeah, next
I'm there
semester,
Wednesday mornings.
Wednesday
Yep.
mornings. Can people who have cortisol issues come a little bit later in the day or?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Wonderful. I would really like to do that for sure.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. And I also would love to maybe another time, if we revisit this, talk about maybe like point protocols that you might use
Sure.
for addiction for our acupuncturist friends who are
Sure.
listening. I think that would be great. Just like, obviously apart from NADA, which is very famous and beautiful and wonderful, it's the detox protocol. But yeah, some other stuff that you do in your
Sure.
practice.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. Well, thank you as always for being such a great chat. And
Well, thank you for hosting and such good questions.
I try. Thank you. All right. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, Angela.
You too.
And everyone listening.
And everyone
Thanks,
listening.
everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Oh my God. Okay.